Why do we have this idea that everywhere else outside of our motherland is a better destination for us? Like we need to reprogram ourselves to what it actually means to relax.
Hi everybody, welcome to the Do You Know Black Creators Kickback. I'm Darnell.
And I'm Alyssa, and we're the creators and executive producers of the Do You Know Black game show and the Do You Know Black Kickback.
In the last episode of Do You Know Black Kickback, our contestants were asked if given the racial tensions in America, should African Americans be planning an exodus back to Africa? So Alyssa, I'm gonna let you start this one. Do you think that African Americans should be planning an exodus back to Africa?
I loved this episode because I loved all the different perspectives, and I think that we could all agree that there is no clear answer to this. I think that there is a space for whatever you decide to do. So I do feel like, I think this may have been Jasmine who specifically said this. There are some people who are gonna thrive and succeed, do well here. And then there are people who are best suited to thrive back in Africa. I think that what we need to start with, which is again a point that Elliot brought up, is we need to start with the relationship first. I think that before we can even get to that discussion about what we're going to go do in Africa, we need to repair the relationships between African Americans and Africans and then start from there.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. This episode was, most of the episodes I felt I got what I needed to get out of it in watching it one time. And this episode, it wasn't until maybe the 8th time that I watched it a bunch of times because I had to, but it wasn't until like the 8th or 9th episode that I finally got something different out of it. And I was like, whoa, I didn't get that. So first and foremost, I would challenge anybody that watched it to watch it a second time with some of the thoughts that we have here, because your perspective may change on what it is, because I think it was a lot deeper than I expected it to be. When we created this question, and we thought it was an important topic in general, given some of the things, like for example, some of the work that Akon's been doing, and he's spoken out about like how many opportunities there are for us in Africa from a business perspective, etc. So in my mind, I thought it was gonna be something much more straightforward and direct, talking about leaving for opportunities there versus like staying here. And I thought it was gonna be basic, but as I watched the episode more times, I realized how complex this question was. They're talking about, one, the relationship with Africa, understanding Africa, it's a continent, right? There are so many different cultures and spaces. Like, where would you want to go in Africa? Do you even have the information about like what that experience is like? Obviously, my background or origin is Africa, but I'm a first generation Haitian. So my grandparents chose to move here, which is part of my story, and I come to these discussions with a certain lens as well. Kind of living within both cultures in America. So there's that, but there's this piece of understanding, like there's so much we don't know about Africa because we're never taught about it, all right? So that's one. They talk about the fact that we are not a monolith, right? Or a monolith, where you're gonna have some people that are gonna wanna come here versus stay here versus go back. So that's a conversation that they had, and talking about the differences and what does that actually mean. Then you have some people that are talking about the idea of all of the things, like would us going back to Africa be good for Africa, right? So that's kind of like another question that was brought up. So all of these questions that I overlooked in the first time I watched it were things that I started to think about as I watched it more times. So you look like you have thoughts, so I'll let you chime in.
No, because I think that I want to unpack the last concept that came up, the idea of would us be going back like be helpful to Africa. I think that before we unpack that, I think that's a whole separate section, but I want to go back to the idea of the relationship between Black Americans, because not everyone here would consider themselves to be African American, but everyone, the blacks living in America versus the Africans back in Africa, and just this relationship. And I think that, you know, as blacks in America, there's an identity crisis that's been going on, obviously, because there's so many different things that we've been stripped from, you know, that's really stripped us of our identity. So the idea of, you know, half of us coming here, our ancestors coming here as slaves, not understanding where in Africa your family is from, really keeps you from that sense of pride. You know, Marcus brings up the point of, you know, how proud he was when he went to Nigeria. We didn't get into it in the episode, so I'm not sure if that's part of his background, if he knows that's part of his background. But I think just in general, we can agree that as Black people going to Africa, going somewhere in Africa, you would feel a sense of pride. But I do think that it's important, which is again another point that Tiara brought up, the idea of us getting DNA tested. We know in other cultures they do this. So it's been a sense of pride for Jewish people to have their birthright trip to Israel, you know, something that the government there pays for people, young Jewish people living in America. And I'm not sure whether they do this with Jewish citizens in other countries if they also get to go back. But this is a fully paid for trip to go back, and it's their birthright trip. I think that there's something so proud about that moment for them, where you come back feeling really refreshed from what I've heard. And I know that was the same experience with a lot of people who went to Ghana with the Back to Africa, with the trip to Ghana that happened, the year of return in a couple of years ago. That should be something that I fully, when we talk about reparations and what Black people should be getting or need, this is one thing that I feel like, regardless of whether people feel at surface is valuable to them, I think that this is something that we could collectively say, hey, like the government should say, hey, this is not divisive. Like, we will agree that regardless of what else, we'll figure out on the back end later on what you're going to get, but we can agree that we will pay for the DNA testing with African ancestry, right? Like a company that's actually focused on helping us identify our tribes. We will pay for this DNA testing, and then we will pay for your birthright trip to your place in Africa. I think there's obviously that's an oversimplification of it, because, you know, there are parts of Africa that are not safe to travel at this point. They're at a different stage. So finding out that you're from there does not mean you're going to be able to take a trip there. But I think that we can identify that that's a start, right? Like, pay for the DNA testing, pay for the trip, gain some sense of pride, and then we need to come back and we'll touch on this a little bit more, but we need to really come back and dive into our own issues before we decide to, like, we're gonna pick up and move. You would never do that in any other sense here in this country. You don't just get up and move to another state. Some people do that, but you've been there before, or you have an idea of why you're going there. You know, like, this place, I want to start my career in entertainment. I'm going to move to LA. Even if I have no family there, I have no friends there, I know enough that this is a place for me to go, right? Same thing with New York or other centers around the country. People have an idea of why they're going. I think before we can get Black people to that point here, they need to understand why they want to go there. So whether that's understanding what their background is there, understanding what is in these places, and having like a sense of pride about it will really put us in a better position, you know, to empower people to want to move there down the line.
At a very minimum, I 100% agree. No matter what you think about with anything else, at a very minimum, helping descendants of slaves know who they are, like, inside, and where they're from, I think is at a minimum what can be done as a foundation before you get into all the other divisive discussions around reparations. I don't think that's divisive at all. So I do think that that's a good place to start for one. So I just wanted to agree with that. And I think that's so important, because when we start talking about reparations, I think it's easy to say reparations in theory, but then when you start talking about, okay, what does that look like? I think everybody can agree that should be included.
Going back to the idea that Michael had brought up And you might, I can't remember the exact verbiage, so if you do jump in, but he made a reference to not tracking mud in your mother's house, and the idea, which was essentially an idea that, you know, as Blacks living in America, we're skipping an important step, and I'll let you touch on that. So what do we need to do before we decide that we're gonna go back? Because we say it is like, it's a positive thing inherently, like, oh, we're going back, we're so excited, we're gonna go back and to our motherland, you know. But there are people who already exist there. They are living and working and thriving and whatever the case is there. So this, we're saying it as if it's this natural progression, and us just going there is a good thing for us. But what is it giving to the people that are there? You know, so I want you to touch on that, because I know you had some thoughts on that initially.
So what he was speaking about was, he was talking about like the decolonization of the mind. And a lot of people would hear that and they'll be like, oh, he's on that tip, like whatever that is, right? Like some people can get turned off of it, but when he defines it, when he talks about decolonization of the mind, and I think what he was really saying there was, as Blacks in America, or as people that aren't necessarily from America, which is a large portion of America at this point, we have inherited a lot emotionally and mentally and spiritually, inherited a lot of things that have made us lose our balance in who we are as a person, right? A person, and he's basically saying that like there's a lot of these things that we adopt. He talks about like certain traits or issues that we as people have. So for example, when we think about music and the way sometimes that music may portray women, right? Or the language that we use to refer to our Black women, or just that might be one example, right? That's embedded in how we think about women, right? And a lot of it is based on the Western media, right, in America. So it's saying that if you don't decolonize your mind, or if you don't cleanse your spirit of some of these things that you've learned here in America because of the nature of America, you're gonna take this broken ideology and bring it to Africa with you. So he's like, before you even think about moving back there, there has to be a cleansing of yourself, your self-identity, who you are, and getting this deeper understanding and restoring like a more healthy understanding of you, and restoring a more healthy understanding of your people and your relationships. And it goes back to the other component that I talked about, which is, unless we do that, then us going back to Africa, they may not want us there, right? Like, we may not be adding value when the Europeans came here, right? And when the Europeans came here, and it's like they were bringing to the natives, they were exposing the Native Americans to like smallpox and all these different diseases that they had that had this really negative impact on the native population here. So for obvious reasons, I understand that, like, no offense in that analogy, but like in this sense, it's like all of those things that are broken here would be going there and potentially polluting that culture with some of the brokenness that we've learned in America. So he mentioned that, and as a very first step, and it's an important process that we have to think about, and looping it into something that's very recent is what I'm seeing more from our peers is a lot more friends are talking about, hey, I'm seeing a therapist, because I think we feel like we need this like repair. So Michael really just made me think about all of that with what he said, and that's step one before we even talk about going back.
Yeah, I mean, I think just in summary to what you said in response to what he said, it's all about restoration. And I think that's the first thing that we need to figure out, because we're skipping steps here. Like, if we were to just jump to that as being a solution, it's not a solution, but we're skipping a major step here. I think the solution, or the start to the solution, is restoration and figuring out what that looks like for us, because it might be different for different people. But I think just in general, we understand that as a community, we have a lot of healing to do. So how can we, I don't think we ever sit down and address what that is. We always talk about solutions to things that are placed on us. Like, what are the solutions to our oppression? What are the solutions to our, this is rooted in this, but like, to poverty, or to lack of opportunity, or to all of these other things that are rooted in oppression. But at the end of the day, like, we do need solutions for those, but it's just like they say with the airplane example, like, don't put on your mask first before you put on the mask of your child or someone next to you. You can't help someone unless you've helped yourself first. And I think that ties back to this whole idea. We're thinking about it the wrong way. Like, the Africa exodus is, to some people, a solution to what we're facing here, our oppression here, but it's not a solution to the trauma we've experienced or the healing that needs to happen. We have to do all of that before we can even think of going back to Africa. Otherwise, we're, like he says, just dragging our mud into our mother's home. So Michael did bring up a lot of good points. I think everyone had. I loved the conversation. I think that everybody had some really good points that they brought up, but he had brought up something else that really stuck with me, which was the idea of this idea that we're not a monolith, and we say this, over and over again. We repeat this, and it has been something that's big in the last couple of years. And I agree that we are not. And I think that it's something that we kind of push, that it's a narrative that we continue to push. But I think that what he brought up was the idea that sometimes it's not a bad thing to be, right? We may not be a monolith, but sometimes we have to be. If we're really trying to go far, you might remember the quote, I'm struggling to remember it, where it says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think that ties into the idea of monolith. Like, yeah, we're not a monolith, but if we want to go far, we're going to have to. We have to join forces. So that's going to require on our end a consensus. We can all agree that we don't necessarily agree or have the same mindset, but we can agree that we need to each compromise on what our side is so we can get something done. So I was curious about your thoughts when he made that statement.
Well, I want to get into that. So let's not forget that we're talking about the idea of monolith, because that's a full conversation in itself that I want to do justice to. One last thing that kind of attaches to the other thing that Michael said as well is when we talk about a lot of, they spoke about the idea, well, actually this kind of segues into the idea of monolith, where the things that have brought Black people together have been rooted in trauma, right? And he was basically saying that that's kind of an issue, right? Where I think he was saying that that's an issue, but he said that, like, when we think about it, there are a lot of these spiritual things. Like, there's a spiritual component that brings us together without getting into religion. Specifically, growing up, I grew up, I'm Christian, and spiritually we always had and still have like a spiritual circle of people. And there's something that, like, when I'm close to that, and when I'm close to that people, and close to that community, and close to that village, and rooted in thinking about spiritual wellness and who we are, it's like it gives me a certain type of energy. And then there are those seasons in life when it's like, I'm so busy, I'm not like taking that time that I need to be taking, or whatever it is. And then after a while, you start to realize, like, you lose yourself, and then, like, you get tired and you get fatigued and you get all these things. He wasn't speaking specifically about that. That's how, that's my background. But what he was talking about was this idea of, like, rooting our togetherness and our unity in something that's bigger than what was put onto us, right? Like you were mentioning, oppression put onto us, rooting it in something different and finding that togetherness there as part of the repair.
I mean, he was saying that, but I think what he was also not even alluding to, what he said was the idea that these are things that we don't even necessarily know are commonalities, right? Like we should, because we were ripped away from that. But, and I can't remember the specific, he was naming, I believe, a few deities, or shamans, or he was naming, these things that are very specific to various aspects of spirituality in Africa, like these ideas that you believe in this God and this power, or you have these figures, the structure that we have within certain tribes in Africa are essentially rooted in like what we should be looking for. Like the idea that we have, because I think he was referring to Tiara when she mentioned that even though people are kind of, even within Black people, we're divided on the idea of a Black president. We didn't all love him, but the idea of him was something that ideally would have rooted us. We could have all appreciated the fact that we had a Black president. And he was saying, you get that and more when you're when you're part of this tribe. You have a figure that acts as that serves as that figure that the president here gives us, a Black president here would give us. So I think that part of what he was saying is like, I think it goes back to connection and understanding our roots and having a source of pride and understanding for that. When you know where you came from, if you can sit there and say, well, I know my tribe, my family is from Africa, we're Igbo tribe, this is what that tribe believes in. I now have something to look forward to. I now have something to look into. And these things can be my source of pride, as opposed to the figureheads here or material possessions and objects and moments that you would find here. We could get that and more if we just reconnect to our people.
Yeah, and the last thing I want to say about that topic, because I do not want to lose sight of the idea of the monolith, is, and this is a very basic example of the idea of how we can become broken, right? Just emotionally. And this is a very simple example. And I've told you about this before. And it was when the first time I went back to Haiti. It was literally like me, my cousins, my mom. And it was like an amazing experience, like going back so many years. Obviously, we know that there's a lot of troubles in Haiti and et cetera. You want to say something?
I just wanted to clarify, because you said you went back, but that was your first time going there. So you weren't going back. It was your first time there.
Yes. Yeah. So we went back to Haiti, but I went there for the first time. And I went with like my entire family, with the exception of like one or two cousins. But we all went there, and for so many years, my grandfather passed away, many years ago. So after he passed, we went back to his house I'm from the northern part of Haiti, together, and we were walking in the streets where like my mom was like, oh, I used to play in that courtyard, and I used to we went to this school, and like my uncle, he was like, yeah, this was the school, this was the university or whatever that I went to, and all this stuff. And I was like, wow, this is like really cool, this is interesting. But one of the biggest things that I saw when I was over there was the difference in pace, right? Like the difference in pace here. The emotional stress that I have, like just from looking at the time, right? Like the stress that I have at all times, I'm mindful of what time it is, right? Like right now we're taping something and I'm mindful of what time it is. Like I'm mindful of how many hours do I have left in the day? What do I have to get done for the rest of the day? What day of the week it is? What I have to do tomorrow? What time do I have to wake up tomorrow? Like this time I'm constantly thinking about this for the purposes of like output and all this stuff. And then also, like even the relationships we're now with smartphones and social media and all this stuff, like we can find ourselves just like in hours, just like going through hundreds of pieces of content and never getting a chance to digest anything or communicate with people because there are so many distractions. We're easily distracted here. So when I went to Haiti, it was so interesting because a lot of time we didn't have internet service. So like I had my phone, but I didn't have the internet. So that's one. Two, sometimes the electricity would go out because they don't have electricity 24/7. So a lot of the time was spent with me and my cousins just sitting on the roof of this house, catching a breeze and just talking with each other. The pace was so different. So then I was there and I felt so much peace and like relaxation and all this stuff. And then I came back here and then like, I remember we would go out and then now all of a sudden you're looking around and literally everybody's just in their phones, like overindulging and just not paying attention to each other. So it was like people are severed from each other here. And then when I was there for just 10 days, obviously there's benefits to being in a first world country. That's not lost on me when I'm saying this, but I'm just talking about like the spiritual and the emotional component that being in the West or being in a developed country in the West, how it takes certain things away from you emotionally that we have to repair. So I did want to talk about my experience before we moved on to the monolith thing.
And we'll move on to that, but I think just to tack on to what you're saying, because we've had this conversation about the idea, all roads lead back to restoration, right? And I think that our idea in the States is when we need some restoration, we might travel somewhere domestically, like to another state, go to a beach, do something, relax. I think that we should be more thoughtful now when we're planning domestic, international trips. We might go to Thailand, somewhere in Asia, somewhere in Europe, and no one ever considers, I'm not gonna say no one, because a lot of people, Black people do, but you don't hear many countries in Africa that are destinations for relaxation, and I think that we need to make it a point to start, when you talk about exodus, like our exodus, we could start with just where we're vacationing, where we're restoring. I think that we always default back to these ideas of where it's relaxing, when in reality, it's not necessarily. I remember we went to Bali, my sister and I, a few years ago. It was a very long trip. We get there. Yes, it's beautiful, but there's various parts of Bali. So while there was like Ubud, which is very relaxing and quaint, their city, when we were in Seminyak, like it's very busy. It's the roads, everything's jammed up. Like you're standing on the side of the street for 5 minutes trying to cross because there's no stoplights. And you literally think you're gonna get by a car. It's high stress. So the idea that we felt like, oh, this is gonna be our vacation, it's relaxing. Then you get there and it's even more stressful being there because there's just certain things that aren't in place. And you're like, why do we have this idea that everywhere else outside of our motherland is a better destination for us? Like we need to reprogram ourselves to what it actually means to relax, and I think that starts with going back to Africa, going somewhere in Africa and taking it from there.